Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, we're going to get started. So, welcome to Oxford and to CCN. So we should introduce ourselves.
I'm Laurence Hunt.
I'm Chris Summerfield. So we're just going to speak very, very briefly before the main event of, or the first event of the meeting, which is Cate Hartley's talk.
So we just need to start out with a few very kind of low-level, mundane announcements, as always needs to be the case at the beginning of conferences. So we're not expecting there to be any fire alarms, scheduled fire alarms during the course of the conference. So if you do hear a fire alarm, it's likely to be a real one. The staff will guide you towards the nearest exit, which will probably be down and out through the quad. And there's a gathering point out on Merton Street. The other thing that you can see from the room that we're in is that we really are at capacity, or we're slightly above capacity for this particular room. So we would really strongly encourage you, as you have done beautifully today, not to leave free spaces sitting between you to fill up the entirety of a space. We can't, unfortunately, have people sitting on the floor. If you are sitting in a room, you need to have your bum on a chair, and that seems to have happened very well here. If this room does become too full for any of the single track events, everything that is happening in here is also being broadcast over to the East Schools, which is the other room through there. So we have an overflow room if you're finding that this room is too full, and we'll have people redirecting people in that direction if that needs to happen. But hopefully that won't cause too much of an issue this year. Okay, so just to set the scene, I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about CCN, the conference, and its history. I'm sure that many of you in this room now see CCN as a firmly established fixture on the conference calendar, and you see it as maybe one of your go-to conferences year on year. And that really wasn't the case only a few years or so ago. It was brought together on the, we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants from people like, who are listed as co-authors on these two sets of papers. Nico Kriegerskorter, Thomas Nassaleris, Kendrick Kay. These are some of the names who were involved in the earliest foundation of CCN back in 2017 and 2018. And what they saw was that there was a real need for a conference at the moment which tried to bring together three different sets of researchers who might have very similar ultimate questions that they wanted to ask. They wanted to ask questions that were fundamentally in some way to do with solving complex cognition or complex behavior. But they were doing so from slightly different perspectives. So we had cognitive scientists who were really interested in questions to do with the mind. We had artificial intelligence, which was about how to train artificial agents to do these kinds of tasks. And then, of course, we had neuroscientists. And the idea of CCN, epitomized in this Venn diagram about which entire review articles have been written, is that these three fields can gain a lot from interacting with one another. So here are some of the founders of CCN back in 2018. It was kind of a brainchild of Kendrick and Thomas to begin with, and then they brought on this kind of crackpot team of other cognitive neuroscientists who also had shared this vision about the way forward for the field. And since then, it's been through about 6 iterations. We've survived a pandemic. We've had 2 online conferences. This is our second time back in Europe since our meeting in Berlin in 2019. And the other thing that's really changed over the course of those 6 or 7 years is that we've seen that this has really kind of captured the spirit and the zeitgeist of the community as a whole. And that's not only kind of reflected in the fact that a lot of the content for CCN as a meeting is generated by the community. We have community-generated submissions for things like our workshops, our Keynote tutorials. We really see it as it's a very exciting way to sit there and see what are the hot topics within CCN that people want to discuss and debate at the conference each year. It's also really strongly reflected in the team of people and the breadth of people who are involved in organizing and putting together CCN each year. And so, although it's Chris and I standing up here and giving the opening remarks, CCN really would not happen if it weren't for the involvement of a huge team of different people who give up their time voluntarily across the course of a year. And so if you do see one of these people at the conference, please do just talk to them, find out a little bit about what their involvement was in the conference, say thank you, buy them a beer, and maybe also think about getting involved in organizing the conference yourself. I'm sure that we really need this to remain a community effort going forward over the years to come.
Fab. So I get the pleasure of saying some of the specific thanks. And so these thanks, of course, come from myself and Laurence, but they also come from all of the community. But I wanted to just before naming specific people, to say a little bit about on a personal note. So when Laurence asked me to help him organize the meeting or co-chair the committee that organizes the meeting, kind of organizing a conference isn't always the most thrilling activity that you might want to pack your day with. But I have to say that for me, it's been actually one of the most fulfilling and really fulfilling activities of my whole career, in fact. And the reason for that is because of the amazing people that I've met on the committee and got to interact with. It's just been absolutely fabulous. Here are just some of them. So on the technical program committee, we had Erin and Bruno. So organizing technical program committee is a big job because it requires coordinating all of the abstract submissions, the reviewers, the decisions, and everything that goes along with that. There's on our communications committee, we have Kim, who's right here, helped by Rui and Steve, who I think are both here as well. Of course, Kim is the guardian of our Twitter account, which is kind of the main means that we have for communicating with you all, as well as by email. Layla has been amazing in organizing the program committee, working out actually what's going to happen. That's especially with help from Megan. And Nick, we couldn't have done without Nick, who has really coordinated everything that, on a practical level, that's happened here on the ground, from making sure that there are pins or Velcro for the posters, through to making sure that the building is still standing for the meeting to happen. So the team of people that Nick has been working with are here. I won't read out all of the names, but these are all students or early career researchers who you have seen around already. They're wearing red t-shirts, and kind of they've done already an absolutely amazing job. There's been lots and lots of work that's happened even before the conference has started. Lots more that's going to happen. So kind of really we owe a great debt of thanks to these people, and of course to the committee members. The previous slide. We also want to thank our sponsors. So CCN, wouldn't be able to get by without really generous support from a number of sources. We've had this year, as in previous years, support from DeepMind, also from Meadows, who are sponsoring the social event. This year, for the first time, we've had support from Elena. Elena are a really exciting computational psychiatry startup who work at the intersection of AI and mental health. They're based in London, and several people from Neuroscience have gone on to work there. From this community have gone on to work there, so you should check them out. We're also really grateful to the BBSRC, that's a UK government-sponsored funding body who've provided a substantial chunk of funding for us, and Kerry Wynne Thomas, who's I think here in the audience today, has been coordinating that, so thank you specifically to her. And lastly, we'd really like to thank the university as well, but specifically, many of you interacted with the online store in order to register. The team who are behind that, who are not here, were just incredible, absolutely amazing, and we're really thankful to them. So those are the thanks. Thanks as well in advance. So these are Ev and Talia, who, I know Talia's here, I haven't seen Ev yet, but Ev and Talia will have very generously agreed to take over organization next year, and there'll be more announcements about that coming. They will be leading the community meeting, which is going to happen on Sunday, which is an opportunity for you all to show up, to tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, and to help us make the conference even better next year.
Great, so that's next year's conference. On to this year's conference. So we want to just very briefly mention that CCN as a meeting has a code of conduct in place. We're really committed to the conference being an experience for everybody free from harassment or inappropriate behavior or any sort of form of scientific misconduct. And we particularly obviously would like to remind faculty or other potential employers that there could be potential power imbalances in the kind of interactions that you might have. We hope, of course, that this would not need to happen at all during the course of the conference, but if anybody feels that they would wish to raise a complaint of some form, then we, of course, welcome that. We either encourage you to report that directly to one of the CCN steering committee, or we also have an anonymous form online if people would like to report something like that anonymously, but hopefully that won't need to happen. On to more cheerful news, which is the submission data for CCN this year. This is a slide which I showed last year, at the end of last year's conference, which tells you about how submissions look for a conference in the run-up to a final submission deadline. And I think last year I spoke somewhat of the kind of existential crisis you feel as a conference organizer of putting together a conference and realizing that about 10 days before the deadline you have 10 papers submitted for your entire conference. But nevertheless, we ended up at about just under 250 papers in San Francisco. You may be able to see the dash line, that's Berlin. We were up at 350 back in 2019. So we thought that if we booked a venue such as this, where we could hold about 300 posters in that room over there, and we could hold 440 people here in this room, we'd be absolutely fine and dandy. And then we faced a somewhat different existential crisis, which struck this year, which was poster submission more than doubled, and we ended up with more posters submitted than we even had capacity for people attending the conference this year. Just point out that this was the release date of GPT-4. Make of that what you will. But that led us to have to put some actions in motion quite quickly to think, how do we handle the fact that we've got more submissions for this year's conference than we might have space for? So we needed to pause registration. Fortunately, at last year's conference, we set up this really fantastic and community-driven review process, which I think is one of the most exciting things about CCN submission, which is that we opt in people who are first or last authors on CCN papers to provide peer review to, I think, about 10 other papers that have been submitted. And that means that, on average, every paper that gets submitted to CCN gets an average of 9 or 10 reviews from other people in the community. And that can include both senior faculty and also early career researchers. And as all of you will have seen, we rank these, we ask reviewers to rank their submissions on these two axes of clarity and impact. And all of the data from this is online and open source. And Dan Goodman, if he's here, did a wonderful reverse analysis of this on Twitter, which you can go and dig out. And then we collapsed this into a single score, which ultimately led us to have a boundary over which we accepted about 70% of submissions and rejected about 30%. So we've ended up with about 360 posters this year, which 24 have been given contributed talks. We've put up a nice big tent to make it feel a little bit more spacious, and we've got this overflow room. We've also had these community-generated submissions for the Keynote tutorials, which again, I think is one of the real strengths of CCN. 7 submitted for those, of which 3 were accepted, and we had 2 GAC submissions, both of which ended up being accepted. Our apologies to those who submitted fantastic work, but didn't get a spot at this year's conference, and also to those who weren't able to attend in person, but we hope that we've tried to mitigate that somewhat, and we're also broadcasting online for the first time. So that's this year's review process.
Okay, and just quickly to highlight, we're over time, but just quickly to highlight some exciting stuff that's happening this year. As previously, we have a representation from the Algonauts competition. This year, for the first time, we have an in-person challenge. There'll be a session with presentations by the winners from this year, and there'll be the hackathon itself happening on Saturday. We've got a workshop that is specifically focused on rethinking academia in a time of climate change, and I think this is a really important interface between social issues and the kind of the work that we do in the lab, and that's led by Anna Rai and Claire Kelly. I'd encourage you to go along. We have a diversity group, so we are a diverse group. There are many, many interests, and we want to ensure that all of them are represented. And so we have a lunch specifically to celebrate the diversity of our community. That's on Sunday. I'd encourage you to go along. And then lastly, an innovation we're using that goes hand in hand with the kind of larger group that we have. So we'll have questions for the keynotes and the contributed talks and other events. But in association with the main stage events, we will also have a Dory. So a Dory, if you don't know, it's a kind of online tool that you can use to submit questions, either anonymously or with your name. It will allow people in the overflow room to still be able to participate by asking questions. And you can access the Dory through a link, which is, I think, available, but if it's not, then you can also just scan this QR code, which will be on all of the slides that line up, that are on the screen in between talks. Just scan it, and that will give you access to the Dory, and you can use that to present. Last but not least, you can't see it very well, but this is, so we really wanted to make CCN's social life really intimate this year, so we decided to hold the party at Laurence's house. So this is where Laurence, no, it's actually not where Laurence lives. So this is a wonderful venue. It's called the ISIS Farmhouse, and that's where we'll be having our social event. There's room for all of you. It's a little bit out of town, but there's a beautiful walk you can take to get there along the river, and we've also commissioned large river steamships to take you there if you would like to do that. So please, for those of you who have a ticket, do come along. There'll be food, music, and embarrassment. You'll find tickets in your badges, and in fact, so there's a ticket for drinks, which will be had, a drink you can have with tonight's poster session, and another ticket for the social event for those of you who have signed up. Okay, I think that's it. So I'm going to hand over to Leila, who is chairing the next session.
All right, hi everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Cate Hartley. She is an associate professor of psychology at New York University. She earned her bachelor's degree at Stanford and then went on to do her PhD at NYU before joining the Sackler Institute at Weill Cornell Medical College, first as a postdoc and then as a faculty member, and then finally coming to NYU. Her lab's research focuses on understanding both the cognitive and neural underpinnings of learning and decision-making throughout the lifespan. And to do this, her lab uses an extremely impressive array of methods that range from functional neuroimaging to computational modeling to genetics. And so for this impressive body of research, she's earned many awards, including the 2023 Trollin Research Award, as well as early career awards from the National Science Foundation, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and the Society for Neuroeconomics. So today she's going to talk about developing behavioral flexibility. So please join me in welcoming Cate.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here today. I'm excited to share my work with you and to hear all of your work. The program looks really exciting. So as Leila said, the work in my lab focuses on understanding how learning and decision-making change over development. And to illustrate the kind of learning that I'm interested in, I'm going to start with a couple anecdotes, and you'll have to forgive me because these are stories about my children. So I live in Brooklyn, and when my children were younger, on the playground near our house, they installed these water-conserving sprinklers. They're off until you press the top of them, and then the water turns on for a few minutes. The kids run around delighted, and then it shuts off, and they come running back to be the first to press the top again. So when they put this on our local playground, my children learned this response very quickly, and all summer long would run up and press the top of the sprinkler. And then one day in September, we went to the playground. They came running up, pressed the top of the sprinkler, and nothing happened. And I explained to them, the summer's over, probably the parks have shut off the water. You know, I bet when we come tomorrow it will be off too, and probably off until next summer. But all through September and well into October, when we went to the playground, they would run up and press the top of the sprinkler. So, you know, obviously this is a behavior reinforced by the rewarding consequences of this action. But why did it continue to persist for so long, longer than any of us would continue to perform this action? Another story, so both my boys are dog lovers, but we don't have dogs. On the streets of New York City, there are many dogs that you encounter walking around, and one day when my younger son was about 3 or 4 years old, he approached a dog from behind and went to give it a hug, and he surprised it, and it turned around and sort of snapped at him and barked in his face. And he was fine, but he was clearly scared. And when we would see dogs on the street subsequently, I would notice that he would hang back behind me, and I didn't want this learned fear to persist. So I thought, what could I do to encourage him to safely be comfortable with dogs? And I said, when you encounter someone with a dog on the street, you can say, is your dog nice? And you can put your hand out to let the dog smell it first. And to this day, he's now 11 years old, when he encounters a dog on the street, he does, is your dog nice? And so this behavior was clearly well learned and an effective way for him to sort of move past this acquired fear. So these stories are examples of reinforcement learning, agents taking action in the world and observing the positive or negative consequences, the changes in state that occur. And in my lab, we're really interested in using the computational formalisms of reinforcement learning to understand how individuals learn which actions are beneficial and learn models of their environments, and particularly how these learning processes might change over the course of development in systematic ways. And much of this work is informed by what we know about the neurocircuitry that supports these learning processes. This is, of course, a cartoon, but there are a number of subcortical regions that are involved in different types of learning, learning from positive and negative feedback, learning relations between events, learning what predicts salient events, salient outcomes in our environment. And we know from an extensive literature across species, looking at some of these subcortical dependent forms of learning, that they're evident from very early ages, from very early stages of development. But these subcortical regions are embedded within a broader neural circuit, importantly the prefrontal cortex, which broadly supports the ability for individuals to use abstract cognitive representations of their environment, mental models, rules, contexts, goals, and to use these representations to modulate these forms of learning through interaction between these structures. And we also know from decades of study of the development of brain structure and function that the prefrontal cortex continues to develop well into adulthood. This is showing the thinning of the cortical surface of the prefrontal cortex well into an individual's 20s. And this suggests that there are corresponding functional changes in the ability to use these sorts of abstract cognitive representations to modulate learning may similarly show protracted age-related change. And these linear forms of age-related change aren't the only types of change we would expect to see. There are a number of neural signaling systems. In these figures, I'm showing changes in aspects of dopamine signaling that change non-linearly across adolescence and likely have, given the key role for dopamine in reinforcement learning processes, likely have corresponding non-linear effects on aspects of learning. And so broadly, in my lab, we're interested in using some of the formalisms of reinforcement learning to try and get a handle on the nature of developmental changes from childhood to adulthood as these neural circuits are reorganizing. And we might think, using these formalisms, we might be able to describe developmental change in terms of changes in the settings of the parameters that govern learning, maybe changes in the adaptability of those settings to a given learning context, or even changes in the learning algorithm that individuals may be using at different stages of development. And today I'm going to tell you about perhaps examples of each of these. Okay, so first, changes in the settings. So it's been widely demonstrated that individuals differ in the extent to which their evaluations, their learning, is shaped by positive or negative outcomes. And there's a large literature, even outside of the domain of reinforcement learning, suggesting that adolescents show heightened reward sensitivity, but also some findings suggesting when you look at punishment processing that adolescents show increasing sensitivity to negative outcomes. And so in this study, we were interested in asking whether there are systematic age-related changes in these valence biases. And while some past studies have looked at this question, in many of these tasks, the task demands for how to set valence asymmetries to learn optimally may confound the ability to sort of measure age-related change. And so we sought to sort of overcome this limitation. Okay, so we had participants interacting with these point machines. And you'll notice that 3 of these machines deterministically yield 0, 20, or 40 points. And 2 of these machines will yield one outcome 50% of the time and a null outcome the other 50% of the time. So you choose the purple machine, you'll get 80 points half the time and 0 points the other half of the time. On each trial, participants see 2 machines, they make a choice, and then they see the point outcome on that ticket. Participants are, the task is incentive compatible, we tell them try and earn as many points as possible. Okay, they make a series of such choices. Some are free choices, some are forced choices, which ensure that participants are sampling each choice option and able to learn its value. So a key feature of this task is that 2 pairs of machines have equal expected value, but they differ in their variance, the extent to which you receive variable or deterministic outcomes. And we can exploit this feature to measure valence asymmetries in memory. So if we assume that individuals are updating value estimates from trial to trial using a reinforcement learning, error-driven learning process, with a single learning rate, an individual will eventually converge on the expected value of a point machine. But if we instead assume that individuals are learning with different learning rates for positive and negative prediction errors, it's possible that they may be systematically distorting their value estimates if these learning rates are different. So to walk you through, the purple point machine can give 2 outcomes, a non-win outcome, worse than expected, or a win outcome, better than expected. With equivalent positive and negative learning rates, the expected value the value estimate will converge on the expected value, but if an individual is overweighting negative prediction errors relative to positive prediction errors, they'll systematically distort their value estimate to be less than the expected value, leading to risk-averse choices. And conversely, if they have a higher positive than negative learning rate, they'll systematically elevate the subjective value of the machine that yields variable outcomes, leading to risk-seeking choices. So we use this modeling approach to index participants' learning rates. So first, what did we find in the task? If we look at participants' choice behavior on the equal expected value trials, we found, as we hypothesized to some degree, that risk preferences varied non-linearly with age across adolescence, but really in the opposite direction than was suggested by most of the literature focusing on adolescent reward sensitivity and risk-seeking. So here we saw that adolescents showed the greatest risk aversion in their choice behavior. And when we model participants' choices when we fit reinforcement learning models to their choice behavior, we found that a model that includes asymmetric weighting of positive and negative prediction errors best fit participants' choices. And here you see an increasingly negative asymmetry index, which is just the difference between the positive and negative learning rates over their sum. So it's partialing out the absolute magnitude of those learning rates, and we see that it's at its most negative value during adolescence. Okay, So there's another feature of this task that we were, there's another way in which we were interested in examining valence biases, and another feature of this task allowed us to look at how they influence participants' episodic memories. So when participants made choices and received tickets, they not only saw a point outcome on that ticket, they also saw a trial-unique image on every ticket. And after they completed the learning task, we had them do a surprise memory test where they saw all of the 183 old images and an equal number of never-seen-before foil images of objects. And we had them assess whether they were new, whether they'd seen them before or they were new. So first, if we look, we can see evidence that prediction errors were modulating participants' subsequent memory, and this is a result that has been demonstrated in previous studies by multiple labs. So images that were on tickets that were issued by the risky machines were better remembered than those images on tickets from the certain machines. But we can also ask whether the images that individuals remember were influenced by their idiosyncratic valence biases. So we did this in a regression model, and we found a three-way interaction effect, which I'll unpack for you. An interaction between a participant's asymmetry index, the magnitude of the prediction error, so did I surprisingly win 40 points or 80 points, and the sign of the prediction error, did I win or not win on those variable machines. And what we found is that participants who had a negative asymmetry index were increasingly likely to remember images that were associated with larger negative prediction errors. Whereas the participants who had a positive asymmetry index, here in green, apologies to anyone who's red-green colorblind, I'll use my mouse, were increasingly likely to remember images associated with positive prediction errors. So we found that what people remembered were shaped by their biases during learning. Okay. And this is just a plug. I don't know where she is, but my postdoc, Susan Benier, is presenting a poster in which we replicate this behavioral effect, and she's doing work trying to see whether these corresponding valence biases in learning and memory might extend to autobiographical memory. Okay. So here we found that adolescents place greater weight on negative than positive outcomes, conferring risk aversion. And I should say that while this was in conflict with our initial intuitions, we actually gave the adolescents, the participants in this task, a self-report questionnaire assessing their risk preferences in the real world, and found that indeed, like one observes in a large literature, adolescents self-reported the highest levels of risky behavior. So it may be that what we're capturing in this task is really a different construct than something that's predictive of real-world risk-taking. One potential reconciliation between the idea that adolescence is a period of heightened reward sensitivity was highlighted in a really early paper looking at the adaptive properties of valence biases in learning that suggested that when you learn with a pessimistic valuation, when you overweight negative prediction errors, this systematic distortion in your value estimates creates a larger dynamic range for your positive prediction errors that actually makes you a more precise, a more accurate reward learner. We also found that valence asymmetries in learning biased participants' subsequent memory. And we're interested in sort of building on this result in many ways. So first, this negativity bias in memory has been associated with depressive symptoms. And so we're interested in whether, as individuals enter adolescence, whether this negativity bias is apparent longitudinally and whether changes in the negativity bias are associated with vulnerability to internalizing psychiatric symptoms. Okay, so changes in the settings. So another task in which, another sort of learning domain in which we looked for changes in the settings of parameters was in learning the values of states versus actions. So what do I mean by that? I think the paradigm in which state value learning has been studied most extensively, perhaps, is Pavlovian conditioning. So here, the animal will learn very readily that a tone predicts foot shock. It acquires negative valence, and through this learning, The tone acquires the capacity to elicit Pavlovian reactions, what I'm calling here default behavioral responses to expectations of negative or positive outcomes. And I'm calling them reactions because the responses themselves are not learned. Typically, when we expect negative outcomes, the Pavlovian reaction is cessation of ongoing action, behavioral inhibition, with withdrawal behavior, whereas when we expect positive outcomes, there's invigoration of action or approach behavior, so coupling valence and action tendencies together. In contrast, instrumental learning it enables animals to learn arbitrarily flexible behaviors based on their efficacy at bringing about rewarding outcomes. So here, this rodent has the opportunity to learn that if, when it hears the tone, it shuttles over to the other side of this conditioning chamber, it can prevent the shock from happening. This is a signaled active avoidance paradigm. And I like this example because it highlights that these two forms of learning, negative value learning that drives default reactions sort of involuntarily, and this sort of flexible instrumental learning can sit in competition. So this animal cannot be freezing and shuttling at the same time. Okay, so this sort of interaction between these learning systems has been demonstrated extensively across species in adult humans and animals, and here we wanted to ask whether the relative balance between reliance on these learning systems changes systematically with age. We adapted a task that was developed at UCL by Mark Guitart-Massip and collaborators, and this was the framing. We told children, teens, and adults, you'll be interacting with several robots. Some robots are ticket givers, some robots are ticket takers. Your task is to learn the correct response for each robot and try and win as many tickets as possible. On each trial, they first see a robot, then they see its button and have to decide whether to press or not press by making a keyboard response. This is a ticket giver. If you perform the correct response for a ticket giver, you will win a ticket on 80% of trials. The reinforcement was probabilistic. This is a ticket taker. If you perform the correct response for a ticket taker, you will prevent it from taking your ticket the majority of the time. So here I've shown the task contingencies. These two robots are ticket givers, these are ticket takers, and you can see here very clearly that valence and action in this task, the correct action, are orthogonalized. And the key insight here, the ability to sort of measure Pavlovian interference with this instrumental learning, is that Pavlovian learning couples valence and action. And so if an individual is more likely to go for a ticket taker and more likely to withhold action, go for a ticket giver and more likely to withhold action when they expect a potential loss, it should be easier for them to perform the correct response for these two robots where those tendencies sit, they're aligned with the instrumental contingencies than for these two robots where they're in opposition. So what did we find? If we look at the most raw measure of performance, just the total number of tickets won, we see that adolescents showed the best performance in the task, and performance increased substantially with age from childhood into adolescence. We can look at choice behavior more granularly. So here I'm plotting each robot type. These darker two outer bars are the robots for which the Pavlovian tendency and the instrumental contingency are aligned, go to win and no go to avoid losing. The two lighter bars in the middle are those in which they sit in opposition. And you see that adults show a valence by action interaction effect on their choice behavior. It's easier for them to learn for the robots that have instrumental contingencies aligned with the Pavlovian tendencies than those that don't. This is even more pronounced in the children, age 8 to 12. But if we look at the adolescents, we see that their learning is much more balanced. They, like all of the other age groups, I should note that all of our statistical analyses were age continuous, but I'm just plotting these categorically so you can see. They show the best learning for the go to win robot, but relatively equivalent learning across the other conditions. And here we can isolate a measure of performance, a measure of Pavlovian bias, and plot it continuously as a function of age. And again, we see that this bias is at a minimum during adolescence. We can also use reinforcement learning models to try and capture how this learning process is unfolding, how this bias might be applied during learning. And here the intuition is that participants are updating action value estimates. How good is it to go for this robot? But the best fitting model incorporated two distortions in this learning process. So the first is a go bias, and this is just a tendency to prefer button pressing or not pressing in a value-independent manner. And anyone who has interacted a lot with children can imagine that this soaks up a lot of the variance in kids' behavior. They're very button pressy. Okay. The second additional parameter is a Pavlovian bias. So this is a scalar that's being multiplied by the state value estimate. So what does this do? The state value for ticket givers will be positive, and for ticket takers it will be negative. And so if an individual has a positive Pavlovian bias, this will be reflecting the fact that they are less likely to go for a ticket taker. Okay. And indeed, what we found is that if we plot this Pavlovian bias as a function of age, we see that it decreases from childhood into adolescence, and there's a much larger cohort that was collected in a similar task at UCL that suggests that then from adolescence into adulthood, this level of bias may stabilize. Okay. Here our sampling of that young adult range is probably too sparse to make any strong conclusions. Okay, so here we found that Pavlovian interference with instrumental learning was attenuated during adolescence. There's some work suggesting if you administer L-DOPA, which is a dopamine precursor to healthy adults, you see attenuation of Pavlovian biases in this study, although there have been some complexities to that result from other labs. But we can also think about, it's possible that changes in dopaminergic signaling across adolescence may contribute to the malleability of Pavlovian biases. But we can also sort of ask the question of why might it be that Pavlovian biases should be reduced during adolescence if they are. And so one a defining feature of adolescence is that it's a period during which individuals are sort of leaving their parental protection and gaining increasing autonomy and transitioning into new environments. And one problem with Pavlovian biases is that they can very strongly curtail exploration. You encounter a negative outcome, and then if you're unlikely to sort of explore that choice domain again, that myopic tendency can prevent you from from deriving an accurate value estimate or an accurate understanding of the affordances for action in that context. So a reduced Pavlovian bias during this time may promote optimal exploration. So we were this adolescent nonlinearity wasn't necessarily what we expected, but we did see some observations in the literature that were consistent with this. So here, for example, are rodents in the active avoidance paradigm that I told you about previously, where adolescent animals are performing the best. But we also puzzled over this because there's a large literature. It is indeed not the case that adolescents do not learn Pavlovian associations. You put adolescent rodents in a Pavlovian conditioning context, and they readily acquire a Pavlovian conditioned response, and indeed they have the greatest difficulty extinguishing it. So we puzzled over this, and we thought perhaps this reduction in Pavlovian bias is not a change in the setting. Maybe adolescence is a period in which there's the greatest adaptability in the setting of this parameter. And what might the setting of this parameter be adapting to? So we and others have done work previously that focuses centrally on this question. And we've proposed a sort of theoretical conceptual model in which individuals, as they're taking actions in the world, are carrying out ongoing assessments of the controllability of their environment, the degree to which the outcomes they experience are contingent on their actions or are non-contingent. And you can use this inference of controllability to sort of determine how you might behave in a novel environment. If you are in consistently controllable environments, you may have a high estimate of agency and prefer to be proactive, to explore your environment and try and discover instrumental affordances in novel environments. If you're in an uncontrollable environment, in contrast, there's no benefit to trying to learn action outcome contingencies when they're not present. And so instead of deploying the cognitive resources that are required to do this sort of more complex instrumental learning, you may instead rely on these default reactive behaviors. And indeed, we've shown in past studies that manipulating the controllability of a learning environment in a Pavlovian learning context alters the expression of Pavlovian conditioned responses and does so engaging corticostriatal circuitry that's thought to be important for assessing environmental controllability. So here we wanted to directly test this hypothesis about adolescent adaptability. We used the same task design that I told you about, but with an additional manipulation. We introduced an uncontrollable condition where you still have ticket givers and ticket takers, but the probability of getting a ticket from a ticket giver is now 50-50. The probability of losing a ticket from a ticket taker is 50-50. So by definition, these are uncontrollable, this is an uncontrollable environment. There's no correct instrumental action, but you can still demonstrate a Pavlovian bias. You can still be more likely to press for a ticket giver and to not press for a ticket taker. And indeed, we hypothesize that in this uncontrollable condition, Pavlovian biases would be even stronger. Okay, so what did we find? So again, we see that in the controllable condition, this is just plotting tickets 1, that performance is increasing from childhood into adolescence it's best fit by a nonlinear function, but may stabilize into adulthood. If we look at the performance in the uncontrollable condition, of course, it's a chance because you can't influence the number of tickets won. We modeled choice behavior in this task using a model that proposes that individuals, as they are exploring the go and no-go actions, are deriving evidence of the controllability of the environment from the differential reward predictiveness of states versus states and actions. If actions provide additional reward predictive capacity, this is an indication that the environment is controllable, and if they do not, this is an indication that the environment is uncontrollable. And by computing dynamically the log odds evidence from these two, the reward predictiveness of these two sources, within this model, individuals are dynamically adapting a Pavlovian weight based on this estimate of controllability, which in turn determines the weighting placed on instrumental state action values or state values alone that drive Pavlovian responses. And what we found was that adolescents exhibited the most flexible arbitration between these learning computations across conditions, showing the greatest change in their Pavlovian weight, the greatest increase in the uncontrollable condition and decrease in the controllable condition. And Noam Goldway, who's a postdoc in my lab, is presenting this work, so if you're interested in seeing more of the details, you can go to his poster today. Okay, so here we found that rather than showing sort of persistently attenuated Pavlovian bias, the second study suggested that adolescents exhibit the greatest adaptability to the degree of environmental controllability. And it may be the case, again, of course this is sort of our armchair evolutionary psychology speculation, but as adolescents are going out in the world and exploring, assessing the controllability of the environment and knowing when to modulate one's exploratory actions may be particularly important during this developmental stage. But why might this adaptability decrease into adulthood? Well, it may be the case that during adolescence, individuals are sampling the controllability of their environment and then specializing for, well, my environment seems to be controllable, I should prefer instrumental action most of the time, or uncontrollable and I should be more reactive. And indeed, there's evidence from studies in rodents suggesting that exposure to environmental controllability in adolescence biases behavior well into adulthood, making them more exploratory and show less of these sorts of reactive response tendencies. We're also interested in the potential clinical implications of these processes. Heightened reactive responding is characteristic of anxiety disorders and other forms of psychiatric symptomatology, and we're currently conducting a large-scale longitudinal study where we're also going to collect data in order to test the hypothesis that exposure to early environmental uncontrollability may modulate the emergence of anxious symptomatology. Okay, so in both of these sections of the talk, I've told you about cases where when we fit reinforcement learning models to individuals' choice behavior, the nature of the developmental changes that we've observed have either been best captured by changes in the settings, changes in the dynamic range of those settings, but another type of change we might observe is a change in the learning algorithm it might be that a different algorithm best captures the choice behavior of individuals at different ages. To give you an intuition for what we mean by this, we can learn values, we can learn cache values, or we can learn rich mental models of the state transitions that are present in our environment. And these sorts of model-free or model-based, we can use this mental model to compute value using this knowledge of state transitions and the specific outcome expectancies that are present in the environment. And as you can see, if this is a cheese-liking rodent that was trained in this task, this mental model representation confers a greater degree of behavioral flexibility if it's later thirsty. Okay. So we wanted to ask in an early study whether there are systematic changes in the tendency to rely on sort of model-free cached value computation or use of these rich mental models to guide action. And so we adapted a task that you probably all know that was developed by my collaborator Nathaniel Daw, the two-step task, that can dissociate these two learning strategies. So very briefly, participants make a first stage choice here between two spaceships, each of which usually makes a common transition to a second stage state, here planets, or a rare transition to the opposing second stage state. We told participants in this task the aliens in these planets are mining space treasure. When they hit a part of the mine that has a lot of treasure, they're friendly, they're likely to share it. But sometimes they hit parts of the mine that are difficult to dig through, and during that period, they might not have a lot of treasure to share. We give them an intuition for the gradually drifting probabilities of reward. Okay, so we can exploit this task structure to index an individual's reliance on these two learning strategies. A model-free learner, if they make a choice of a spaceship and are rewarded, are likely to repeat the same first stage action, this main effective reward. Whereas a model-based learner, if they make a choice of a spaceship that's followed by a rare transition, they can use this knowledge of the task structure and instead should switch if they want to return to that second stage state again and see whether the alien still has treasure to share, reflected by this reward by transition interaction effect. If we look at choice behavior in adults, we see that, and I should note that this replicates quite nicely Nathaniel Daw's original results in the original version of the task that didn't have spaceships and aliens and treasure, which reassured us that we hadn't really, we hadn't done any damage to the measurement properties of the task in this adaptation. And what we see is that adults, here 18 to 25, show a hybrid choice signature. They are sensitive to, they show a main effective reward, but they also show a reward transition interaction effect showing that they're using transition structure knowledge to guide choices. Adolescents also show this hybrid signature of learning. But if we look at the choice behavior of children, we see that they look like the sort of cartoon canonical model-free chooser that I showed you on the last slide. And here we can just isolate the reward by transition random effect for each individual and plot it as a function of age, and we see that it increases linearly with age. So here we found that model-based learning increased only emerging during adolescence and strengthening into adulthood. The conclusion I don't want you to draw here is that I'm saying that children are incapable of model-based learning. Instead, I think there are an array of tasks. Here is a probably around 9 or 10 month infant performing Piaget's A not B task. You can think of many tasks in which individuals make sorts of perseverative choices that look like sort of habitual or stamped-in actions as actions that are initially guided by a model-free value computation and may transition to later being guided by a mental representation of the task structure and the current goal, but that these may happen at different developmental time points, depending perhaps on the complexity of the model, the representation and use of the model. And in this simple A not B task, this transition is happening between 9 and 12 months rather than age 8 to 25. Okay. So one thing you might be thinking is, you told me about a complicated task. Maybe children are not actually they don't understand the task, or they're not learning the task structure, and this may be why they don't show evidence of using that structure in their choices. And that was not the case. So we collected explicit reports of task structure knowledge, just, what planet does this spaceship, what will it take you to most of the time? And children, adolescents, and adults were all equally accurate in their reported task structure knowledge. But we can also derive another measure of task structure knowledge. So here what I'm plotting is when participants get to the second stage planets, how long it takes them to make a response. And children, adolescents, and adults are all equally here slower to make choices following the rare transitions. And so you can think of this as an expectancy violation. I made a choice, I expected to end up on the red planet, but now I'm on the purple planet, and it takes me a little longer to reorient and make that second choice. But the thing that's strange about this interpretation is that if this is an expectancy violation, then this RT difference reflects task structure knowledge. And you would expect that individuals who reflect this knowledge more strongly are also making more model-based choices. They're using this task structure knowledge in their first stage decisions. And we saw that this was the case. This correlation was present for adults. This is RT versus their model-based estimate. The relation was present for adults, present for adolescents, but there was no such relation in the children. And this was puzzling to us because it suggested that children were learning but not using their mental model of the task structure. In an array of subsequent studies, which I won't tell you the details of right now, but I'll just give you a sort of overview of this theme, we've similarly observed several times cases where children seem to be acquiring task structure knowledge, learning it, but not using it in their choices. When we give them explicit instructions, it guides their initial exploration, but they end up learning values as if they were derived strictly from experience, where adults' choices are biased by this explicitly conferred instruction. When we have them make causal inferences about potential hidden agents who may be intervening on the reward structure of the environment, children can learn the rules that govern these interventions and report when they think interventions are happening, but only at older ages do we see that individuals' value computations are sort of rationally discounting when they think they're observing outcomes that weren't brought about by their own actions. So they're not use of these causal inferences. In a task where individuals can perform most optimally by preferentially remembering information associated with high-frequency stimuli, children are able, children are able to learn the difference in frequency between the two stimuli, but with increasing age, we see use of this task structure knowledge to prioritize maintaining or encoding associated information in memory. And this increase is associated here with greater engagement of prefrontal cortex with increasing age. So in all of these studies, we're seeing instances where individuals seem to be acquiring task structure knowledge but not using it. And this is from the newest Sutton and Bartow reinforcement learning book. And I like this figure because it highlights how there are two functions that experience can play in reinforcement learning. One is that experience with positive or negative outcomes can drive direct RL and can lead to updating of action values that drive subsequent actions. And another is that the observations of changes in state including reward, can enable individuals to construct models of their environment. And children seem to be doing both of these. We see evidence that children are using both of these paths. They're demonstrating that both of these functions are occurring, but what we're not seeing, or what we're seeing, where we're seeing this sort of developmental protracted change, is in this sort of closing the loop, in using task-structured knowledge to determine, to compute action values and to have them guide choice. And so we're really interested in why. Like, what are the developmental constraints that are preventing children at younger ages from using structured knowledge that they've acquired? One possibility is that there's sort of a developmental bias that's somehow built in. You know, it's possible that children's mental models across a number of domains are inherently more uncertain, just given that they have less experience in the world. And whether this arises from sort of scaffolding on sort of more general schematic knowledge, or just a change in the tuning of the learning system, it may be that there's a bias at earlier ages to rely on values computed from direct experience until confidence in the structured knowledge they've acquired is higher. We're also interested in the idea that there may be developmental changes in the sort of representational format of task structure knowledge. There's work from sort of neural population coding that suggests that there are different optimal representational geometries for sort of discovering the structure that's present in a task versus using that structure to control behavior. And it may be the case that there are sort of developmental shifts in the nature of the neural representations that bias individuals towards learning, but at the cost of effective use. And these are some hypotheses that that we're currently interested in, and I'm happy to discuss. Okay, so to wrap up, here I told you about a collection of studies in which we observed different sort of forms of change, different functional forms of change in the nature of reinforcement learning from childhood to adulthood, changes in settings, adaptability, and algorithms. Going forward, there are lots of directions that we're in the process of exploring. So first, okay, this should be animated, but I'll just go through it. So first, the results that I've told you about here are all quite descriptive. I'm showing you age on the x-axis and showing you changes in values on the y-axis as a function of age. But how? Why? In one case, in the case of adaptability, we discussed the idea that aspects of the environmental statistics of the learner may be governing the settings of these parameters. And we're interested more broadly in understanding both what sorts of information individuals are taking in over developmental timescales that might be that might generate the process of developmental change, and in constructing models that build this sort of mechanism of change into the model rather than using these parameter estimates as sort of descriptive indices. We're also interested in probing the neurobiological mechanisms that underlie these changes sort of across all of these domains, changes in algorithm, changes in settings, to understand better what these mean at an implementational level. And we're also currently conducting work in which, across many of the studies that I told you about today, we're examining potential relations between these parameter estimates for individuals at different ages and vulnerability to psychopathology. Just about all of these reinforcement learning processes that I've told you about have been linked in studies in adults to different dimensions of psychiatric symptoms, and so we're interested in taking a developmental approach to understand how these learning tendencies may relate to real-world decision-making generally and mental health. Okay, thank you for your attention. I want to, oh, my last slide is missing two people I added, but also Kate Nessenbaum and Allie Cohen, whose work was featured here, lab members past and present, as well as the current members of my lab. Thank funding sources, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for a fabulous talk. Okay, so we have, for people in this room, 3 mics that are going to be set up, 1, 2, 3, that you can line up behind to ask your questions. And we're going to be alternating these with the questions that were asked online. So I'm gonna call on people and then switch between in-room and online questions.
Thank you for a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. Specifically, the concept of no model based in kids explains so much of my kids' behavior. Really helpful. I want to ask both conceptual and technical questions regarding your fits. So in all the plots, you had huge variability there. And first, I wonder if you have any explainability for it. Is it related to IQ, to environmental factor, any things that you have tested or just, insights for? And the other thing on the technical side, what fit were you using? Because it was always peaking in adolescent, and I wonder if, it's just the functions that you fit that will always have a peak. And how do you control for bias just by the functions that you fit?
Okay. I'll probably take them out of order just as a function of my memory. So in most of the plots where I showed you individual fits in the studies here, the computational model fitting was done by maximum likelihood estimation, so not considering group, not considering the broader group or using any sort of regularizing prior to influence those fits. I think it really is a matter of debate how to when you imagine that there might be age-related change in a parameter, how to go about using sort of Bayesian model fitting approaches properly. But in these studies, we were just using individual data and MLE. Variability, yes. The variability in choice behavior does change as a function of age as well. There's a lot of individual variability here. We are interested in the idea, as I hinted at the end, that some of the individual variability, the age-independent individual variability even might be interesting and have predictive value. And indeed, that's been shown for things like the two-step task and the ability to predict compulsive behavior, that the variability might be meaningful. But with age, we see a few things. So a parameter that I showed you nowhere in this talk, the sort of inverse temperature that we're using in all of these these fitting procedures to convert value estimates into choice probabilities. One of the findings that we see most commonly in nearly every study where we've done RL modeling is that choices grow more value dependent and less stochastic with age. So that's one way in which variability is being reduced systematically with age. IQ. So what we commonly do in our studies, we often collect IQ measures, but what we're typically interested in is whether it presents a confound for interpreting our age results. So what we typically look at is, does estimated IQ vary as a function of age? If it does, we put it into, we try and regress out that relation in our assessment of age-related effects. What we haven't done for a number of reasons is look at the relationship between individual IQ and measurements of learning or parameters of interest. Because it's not really the feature that we've been we've been particularly interested in studying. So we really want to know we want to be sure that our age effects are not explained by differences, for example, in the cohorts we're sampling from. Are we bringing in college students as adults and children with higher or lower IQs? So that's been the way in which we've used those measurements mostly in the past. Did I miss more?
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for this inspiring talk. I was caught by your initial stories about your kids. How do you explain them? I mean, it's so simple, right? There's no model. The relations are so basic. Why does it take them so much longer to get this, whatever, extinction?
Pressing the top of the sprinkler. It's a good question. Like the reasons why I've chosen those anecdotes to tell is that response sort of resembles action that might be driven by a cached value. That if I'm a model-free learner who is, every time I press the top of that sprinkler and get to run around, I'm incrementing the value of pressing it. And only that day in September when it stops working do I begin to experience these negative prediction errors. What happens if you're learning using cache values and not a model is that you have an extinction curve. And so you gradually see sort of decreases in that behavior. So, you know, in some sense, my kids' behavior is sort of consistent with that sort of learning. But, you know, again, it's very strange. The first time it happened, I conveyed to the kids a kind of explicit account of why the action might not, like why can they not, why is their action not guided by that information that they could certainly report back to me again. They have, you know, they've learned that kind of explicit account. Yeah, I don't, you know, you might think about the second story about the dog as, you know, maybe related to the potential to learn that sort of interaction is a controllable environment, controlled by that kind of exploratory questioning the dog owner, putting your hand out and gathering some evidence, and that you know, ability to exert control sort of decreases the reliance on the withdrawal reaction. In that sense, you know, maybe that's a sign of adaptability or something. Yeah. Thanks. I don't have a better answer for you, but it's sort of they're the anecdotes that kind of inspire the attempt to pin these things down in the lab. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to do one online question, and then we can go over there. So the question is, in pretty much every scatter plot showed, it looks like adolescents show much lower inter-individual variations than younger or older people. Is that of relevance?
Yeah, that's certainly true in those two studies. I don't know whether, okay, so the first thing I'll say is that in both the study of valence biases and in Pavlovian biases, those sample sizes are extremely small. Those sample sizes are small because those were data sets that were collected in laboratory studies where every single one of those 60 or 90 participants was brought into the lab and tested by an experimenter in a 1 hour long session. What we are doing now is doing a lot of we've sort of developed a framework that facilitates doing online testing in children. And so both of those studies were currently collecting data in these tasks from sample sizes of 600 to 800. So I think only with a larger sample size would I be tempted to sort of interpret whether the compression of variability in adolescence is real, but it's certainly there in those plots. I should note that when I'm plotting those effect estimates with a measure of the variance, in some of those studies, our sampling of adults is it's sparser because we have, say, 20 adults across a larger age range. And so part of the increase in the error bars that you're seeing in adults is because there is an equivalent density of participants at every level. So that's another kind of caveat. Yeah.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll go there, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just had a really small question, which is you showed an interaction between the balance of learning rates and differently valence prediction errors. And I just wondered if those two things are really independent, because actually you even then talked about later how having a particular type of, having a greater negative bias might then lead to having greater range in the positive prediction errors. So whether you...
Yeah, so it's a good question. So of course, the asymmetry in your prediction error is going to drive the degree of risk aversion or risk seeking in your choices, which is going to systematically distort the sort of sign of the, if it drives risk seeking in this task, it will produce prediction errors of both signs. If it drives risk aversion, it will attenuate the exposure to negative prediction errors. But what we found is that individuals who become risk averse, and so they are sampling the deterministic outcomes more frequently, which will yield only win outcomes and attenuate exposure to prediction errors entirely are still showing greater sensitivity to negative prediction errors. So there is this sort of there's this sort of fundamental non-independence of the two terms that are in that regression, or it's not non-independence, but the nature of the value of the asymmetry index is going to influence the statistics, the number, and the sign of the prediction errors that are encountered. But these results sort of hold independently of those that influence. I think conceptually it's also an interesting question, the way in which individuals' decision biases are shaping the types of surprising outcomes that they're exposed to, right? Risk aversion will reduce your exposure to negative prediction errors, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
So, like, fundamentally, I think that's like probably a driver of the behavior, but I don't think it's a confound in the memory analysis. Yeah.
All right, I think this is our last question in the center.
You mentioned during the talk that reinforcement learning can affect the outcomes in multiple ways from experience. There's the direct reinforcement learning where you're just updating your value functions, and then there's the more indirect approach where you're building more advanced models. And I was curious if you managed to isolate that function at different age levels. Is this difference in how reinforcement learning happens, does that change over time? Are adolescents and children more likely to learn via direct reinforcement learning or via building more advanced models of their environment?
I guess, at some level, I'm not sure how to answer that. Like, what we see when we put participants in these tasks where we're asking them to make choices, we're seeing that the choice behavior of younger individuals seems to be driven more by direct reinforcement learning. But when we probe them in various ways to assess their knowledge of the task structure, we see that the knowledge is there. So, we're seeing that adults are more likely in these, novel learning environments. I mean, you can sort of imagine, like, the child has as much experience with this spaceship mining, planet environment as the adult, but somehow adults are able to use an equivalent amount of experience in this environment, but use their structured knowledge of the rules of the task to guide their choices. So far, we've sort of been puzzling over the why, but I think there are certainly also domains in which structured knowledge is influencing the behavior of young children. So it's not, I don't think of these things as strictly age associated. I talked about Piaget's A not B task, but so one question is, like, what's the process of change between structured knowledge that is not being used and structured knowledge that then is later being used to guide action? It seems that that's not strictly an age, that conversion is not a tightly age-linked process. I imagine there's something about the nature of the knowledge representation, or that where somehow there's some time-dependent process in children, and time-dependent is a bit of a cop-out. I bet it's more than time-dependent and somehow experience-dependent, but I don't know. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the amazing talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, please join me in thanking Kate one more time for a great talk.
Okay, just one more quick announcement. So we're about to go into the poster sessions at which your drink token will become valid, the one with a CCN logo. So there are 2 bars. There's one bar in here, and there's another bar down in the marquee. And after you've used your drink token, it will turn into a cash bar, so you can carry on